In this video, we'll learn about Diagnostics tab in the render settings. Here you can find out where you have problems in your render and debug those problems, enable or disable certain features, and also add a text overlay to your render. Arnold generates a log to report rendering steps and any warnings and errors. By default, you can see it is saved to Cinema 4D's console, but if I wanted to, I can disable console and enable file and save that log file wherever I want to. Let's disable file and enable console. We have verbosity levels, which specifies how detailed the log message should be. So when set to errors, the log would only contain errors. If set to warning, both errors and warning messages will show up. If set to info, you are going to get errors, warnings, and different information and statistics. And if set to debug, it will show everything and might increase your render time. We have max warning, which limits the number of warning messages. These render statistics and profile logs allow you to generate a JavaScript notation file, which gives you timing statistics about all the objects and the nodes in the scene, which you can use it to identify what part of the render takes the longest and therefore optimize your scene and render. Abort on error will stop the render as soon as Arnold detects an error. If abort on render is disabled, texture errors will show up in red in your render, and NaN errors, which is when a shader returns a number that is not an integer or an RGB value, will show in blue. Remember, when we disabled automatic mip mapping in the texture settings lesson and tried to render the scene with abort on error disabled, the textures became kind of a red solid color. That was the texture error color. Next, we have user options. This field allows you to access and set Arnold core parameters that are not currently exposed in the C4D2A user interface. It's a bit technical and you can read more about it in the Arnold support page. Then we have feature overrides. As you can see, you have some options and switches which allow you to disable or ignore some of the rendering features. I'm gonna just run the IPR. For example, I can ignore all the textures in my scene or ignore all the shaders. I can disable all the lights in the scene or ignore shadows, ignore subdivision, motion blur, depth of field. This feature overrides section is extremely useful and it allows you to quickly ignore these important features. Imagine you are done with texturing and now you want to do some lighting. You can ignore textures and this way have a faster feedback while lighting and so on. Also, here we have this shader override, which allows you to override the shader for all objects in the scene. So if I define this simple white standard surface shader as my shader override, you can see it will override all the shaders in the scene. And if I clear it out, we are back to where we were. And finally, we have this text overlay section, which allows you to overlay some information about the scene and render settings on top of your final render. It gives you 3 lines, which you can fill them out with these tokens or type custom strings to make the overlaid information more readable. We had something similar in the IPR. If you remember, you can check the IPR lesson if you wanted to. The first line by default gives you some information about the scene name, the sample counts, the frame number, render time, and finally time and date of the render. Let's add some camera and lens information to the second line. So let's add the resolution, camera name, and focal length. To make this second line more readable, we can type resolution before the resolution token, camera before the camera token, and type lens before the focal length. Obviously, we can separate them as well. Down here, you can adjust the font size and color, the background color, and so on. Now, if I take a render and wait for the render to be finished, now we should see that info overlaid on top of the render. Cool. So in this video, we'll learn about Diagnostics tab in the render settings. See you in the next video.